The Bow River doesn't forgive mistakes. Anyone who has lived along the foothills of the Canadian Rockies long enough knows that. The water runs fast and black in November, cold enough to stop a heart in under 4 minutes. Constance Harlow knew this because her father had told her when she was 7 years old, standing on the bank in her rubber boots, watching the current tear a log downstream like it weighed nothing. He had crouched beside her, his breath fogging in the autumn air, and said, "The river doesn't care how sorry you are, Connie, it just takes." She hadn't thought about that lesson in 11 years. Not until the night the ice gave way beneath her. The Crowfoot Wilderness Reserve in southern Alberta is one of those places that exist on maps but not really in the minds of most Canadians. It sits west of Cochrane, east of the true mountain passes, a no-man's land of lodgepole pine and frozen creek beds, and the occasional elk trail that dead-ends into nothing. In mid-November it receives exactly 0 visitors. The Warden's cabin, a squat, square-shouldered structure of weathered spruce logs, sat at the end of a gravel road that the county stopped maintaining in October. By November, that road was buried under half a meter of packed snow, and the man who lived at the end of it preferred it that way. Declan Ford had been the reserve's off-season warden for 6 years. Before that, he had been an RCMP officer in Calgary, and before that, a soldier. He was the kind of man whose history you could read in the way he moved. Economical, deliberate, never a wasted gesture. He was 41 years old, broad through the chest and shoulders in the way of men who do physical work rather than gym work, with a jaw that always seemed to carry 3 days of gray-threaded stubble and eyes the flat, pewter color of lake ice just before it freezes solid. He spoke rarely and listened carefully, and he had come to the wilderness originally to heal something he never named aloud, and had simply never left. He was splitting firewood behind the cabin when his dog, a big rangy shepherd cross named Parrish, went rigid and began barking at the river. Declan set down the axe. He listened. Over the shriek of the wind threading through the pines he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. High and thin, like a branch snapping but repeated. Rhythmic, a human sound. He grabbed his coat off the porch railing and walked toward the river. She was in the shallows on the far side, or what had been the shallows before the temperature dropped and created a false shelf of ice over still water. The shelf had broken. She was waist deep, her arms thrown over the solid ice edge, her fingers scrabbling uselessly at the surface. She was wearing a down parka that had absorbed so much water it had become an anchor, and her face, when she turned toward him, was the color of old wax. Declan didn't waste breath on questions. He crossed the footbridge 50 meters upstream at a dead run, came around to her side, lay flat on the ice to distribute his weight, and pulled her out by the collar of her parka. She came out of the water with a sound like a cork from a bottle. He got her onto solid ground she couldn't stand. Her legs had stopped working properly. The cold had shut them down. He picked her up the way you'd carry someone wounded, one arm under her knees, one under her back, and he carried her the full 300 meters back to the cabin without stopping, because stopping would have meant thinking, and thinking would have cost her time she didn't have. Inside, he kicked the door shut. The wood stove was burning low. He crossed to it in 4 strides and threw in 2 birch logs without setting her down first, a feat of coordination born from the particular kind of calm that only descends on people who have been in genuine emergencies before, the calm that isn't peace but is something more useful than peace. He laid her on the cot against the back wall. The cot was covered in a Hudson's Bay wool blanket, cream with the colored stripes, the kind that has been keeping Canadians alive since before Confederation. She was shaking so hard the cot frame rattled against the log wall. "I need to get these wet clothes off you," Declan said, not asking, stating, because there was no room in the next 10 minutes for a conversation. "You're going to go hypothermic if I don't." Her eyes opened. They were dark brown, nearly black, and despite the delirium clouding them, something sharp still lived behind them. She looked at him, this large, unknown man looming over her in a remote wilderness cabin, and that sharp thing behind her eyes ignited into outright terror. No. The word came out barely above a whisper, her teeth knocking together so hard it was almost percussive. "Please, don't. Miss, please." Her arm came up, crossing over her chest, both hands gripping the soaked parka zipper with a strength that surprised him. Not the jacket. Please, not the jacket. Declan stopped. He had seen modesty before, even in survival situations. This wasn't modesty. He had also seen shock and delirium, and this wasn't quite that either. This was a specific, targeted fear, not of him, not of the cold, not of death, but of that jacket coming off. He had been a police officer for 14 years. He knew the difference between fear of a thing and fear of what comes after a thing. "All right," he said quietly, pulling his hands back. "Tell me your name." She stared at him. The firelight was gathering strength now as the birch logs caught, throwing orange warmth across the rough-cut walls. "Willa," she finally said through chattering teeth. "Willa Crane, Willa. My name is Declan Ford. I'm the warden here. I'm not going to hurt you." He reached for the emergency blanket on the shelf above the cot, Mylar, the crinkled silver kind, and wrapped it around her shoulders, over the jacket. "But I need you to understand that wet insulation is worse than no insulation. Whatever is in that jacket, whatever you're protecting, it doesn't matter if you're dead." A long pause. The fire popped. Outside, the wind found the gap under the door and made its low, moaning complaint. "I can't," she whispered. Her eyes filled, and the tears tracked down her face in the specific way of someone who has been crying for a long time and has run nearly dry. "If you see it, if anyone sees it, they will come here. They will come here and they will." She stopped, her jaw clenched. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come this way. My car slid off the access road 2 miles back, and I was trying to follow the river to the highway and the ice. We'll deal with the car later." Declan pulled a chair to the side of the cot and sat down, bringing himself level with her instead of looming. "Right now, just breathe." She breathed, ragged at first, then slower. The shaking eased by degrees as the Mylar blanket and the growing heat from the wood stove began to claw back the warmth the river had stolen. Declan heated water on the camp stove. The wood stove was for warmth, the camp stove for speed, and made her drink a mug of salted broth with honey stirred in, which was the practical northern alternative to the sweet tea that people in movies always seemed to be offering. She drank it without argument, which told him she was more functional than she looked. When the mug was empty, he said, "Can you tell me what you're carrying?" She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face shifted, a calculation happening behind those dark eyes, a weighing of options. Then, slowly, she reached for the zipper of the parka. "Don't react," she said. It was such an odd thing to say that Declan nearly smiled. "I'll do my best." She unzipped the jacket. Beneath it, she was wearing a fleece vest over a thermal layer, and strapped across her torso, snug against her ribs in a configuration that had clearly been worn for days given the raw red marks it had left on her skin, was a flat document harness. The kind made for carrying things that couldn't go in a bag because bags could be lost or taken. The kind with multiple sealed pockets distributed across the chest and sides to sit flat under clothing. It wasn't the harness that made Declan Ford stop breathing. It was the badge clipped to the outermost strap. A Royal Canadian Mounted Police Identification Badge, the kind issued to plainclothes investigators. The crest was scratched and dull. The photo ID was protected by a cracked laminate cover. The name on the badge was Staff Sergeant Raymond Crane. Declan read the name twice. Raymond Crane had been his supervising officer in the Major Crimes Unit in Calgary. Raymond Crane had been the best investigator Declan had ever worked under. A precise, tireless, incorruptible man who had built a case over 3 years against a money laundering network that stretched from Vancouver through Calgary into organized crime connections in Ontario. Raymond Crane had died 14 months ago when his vehicle was forced off the Deerfoot Trail at night. The official finding had been black ice. Declan had never believed it. He stood up slowly from the chair. His hands, which were usually as reliable as the rest of him, were not entirely steady. "Where did you get this?" His voice came out lower than he intended. Willa looked up at him. The calculation in her eyes had become something else now, a desperate, exhausted hope. "He was my father." The word landed in the cabin like a stone into still water. Declan sat back down. "He left it for me," Willa said. She reached into one of the harness's inner pockets with fingers that still trembled from the cold, and withdrew a sealed evidence bag. The standard transparent kind used by every police force in Canada. Inside the bag, folded into quarters, was a dense sheaf of documents. He mailed it to my mother's address in Lethbridge 3 days before he died. A letter inside said if anything happened to him, I was to keep it on my person and bring it to an officer named Declan Ford at the Crowfoot Wilderness Reserve. She met his eyes. He said you were the only one he trusted. The wind hit the cabin hard enough to make the walls groan. A branch somewhere in the dark snapped clean off a tree. Declan looked at the evidence bag for a long time without touching it. He understood in this moment why Raymond Crane had sent his daughter into the wilderness with a dead man's badge strapped to her chest instead of simply mailing the documents. Documents could be intercepted. Mail could be watched. A 20-something woman driving a car through the back roads of Alberta, carrying the evidence against whoever had killed her father inside her jacket. That was the kind of delivery that left no electronic trace, no package tracking number, no record. Raymond Crane had been careful, even in dying. "Who knows you're here?" Declan asked. "No one. I told my mother I was going to a friend's in Canmore. I didn't tell her why. Dad's letter was specific. Tell no one." A pause. "But they've been watching me. I think they've been watching me for weeks." Last night, a car sat outside my apartment in Calgary for 4 hours. This morning it was gone, but She stopped. "I left through the back. I took a car they hadn't seen before. I drove south first, then doubled back west." Her jaw was steadier now, the heat doing its work. "I think I lost them before the highway turnoff. But the access road floods in summer and ices in November. The guardrail on the curve doesn't get much respect from vehicles that don't know it's there." Declan stood. He moved to the cabin's single window and stood to the side of it, not in front. An old habit from a different life. The darkness beyond the glass was absolute. No lights. No movement that he could distinguish from the trees moving in the wind. "You said they've been watching you for weeks. Since before or after your father's accident? Since the day of the funeral?" Willa's voice went very flat on that word, funeral. "There was a man there I didn't know. He stood at the back of the church. When I looked at him directly, he walked out. Describe him." She described him. Declan listened carefully, turning the description in his mind like a stone, looking at all its sides. "His name is probably Pemberton," Declan said, almost to himself. The name tasted familiar and sour. Deputy Commissioner Gerald Pemberton. A name that had come up twice in the margins of Declan's own time on major crimes, always at a distance, always at the precise remove that insulated powerful men from consequences. "He was at the funeral? You know him?" "I know of him." Declan turned away from the window. "Your father's case, the one in these documents, do you know what it concerns?" "Partially." Willa looked down at the sealed bag on the cot beside her. "Dad talked around it for years. He called it the Bridgewater matter. Property development contracts, provincial infrastructure money, and somewhere in the middle of it, a federal oversight body that was supposed to flag the irregularities and didn't. He said the reason it hadn't broken open was that the people involved weren't outside the law. They were the law." Declan pulled his coat from the hook by the door. "What are you doing?" Willa asked. "Checking the road." He checked the load on the .357 revolver he kept holstered above the door, an old service weapon he had never been able to quite leave behind, and slid it into his coat pocket. "Stay away from the windows. Don't open the door for anyone. They couldn't have followed me here. Probably not." He looked at her steadily. "But your father spent 3 years being probably right, and he still went off the Deerfoot. I'd rather be definitely careful. He was gone for 20 minutes. When he came back, he came in through the door fast and quiet, which is different from how a man comes in when everything is fine. 2 sets of tracks on the access road," he said, pulling the door shut and throwing the iron bar across it. "Fresh, on top of my tire tracks from this morning. Someone parked at the road closure barrier and came in on foot." Willa was off the cot before he finished the sentence. "How far?" "They're moving slow. Probably 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours. He crossed to the storage cabinet on the north wall and began pulling things out with the methodical efficiency of someone who has planned for this scenario in the back of their mind and is simply now executing the plan. A second rifle, a Remington 700 in .308, the kind of rifle that does its work cleanly and at distance. A box of shells, a handheld radio on a frequency that wouldn't show up on any scanner tuned to the normal channels. There's a Forest Service road 3 kilometers east. No one knows it's there because it isn't on any civilian map. I found it my second year here. It comes out on the secondary highway near Morley. My car is in a ditch. We'll take my truck." He paused, looking at her. The harness, the documents, the dark eyes that held fear and grief in equal measure but hadn't surrendered to either. Can you walk 3 kilometers in the dark?" "I can walk 30 if I have to," Willa said, and he believed her completely. They moved through the dark forest in silence, Declan setting the pace. Fast but not reckless, the kind of pace that could be sustained. Parrish moved with them, close to Willa's left side, which was either instinct or something the dog had decided for his own reasons. The temperature was 11 below and dropping. Their breath plumed and vanished. The snow under their feet was the dry, packed variety that made little sound, which was fortunate. Declan's mind was working as his body moved. Raymond Crane had trusted him. Out of every officer he had worked with, every colleague and subordinate and investigator in 20 years of federal service, he had trusted Declan Ford, the man who had retreated to a warden's cabin in the foothills, because the weight of what he had seen in cities had eventually become too much to carry in cities. Declan had told himself the retreat was permanent. He had told himself the part of his life that involved caring about justice with the specific voltage that Raymond Crane had always carried. That part was finished. He had been wrong. He understood that now, following a young woman through a frozen forest with a dead man's evidence strapped to her chest. Behind them, at a distance that was difficult to judge through the trees, something cracked. A branch, too regular for wind. "They're closer than I estimated," Declan said quietly. "Keep moving." "I'm moving," Willa said, equally quiet. 50 meters ahead, the tree line broke. His truck sat exactly where he'd left it, a 10-year-old Silverado in the dark green that blended into the tree line in all seasons, which had been a practical choice rather than an aesthetic one. He had the key in the ignition before the truck door fully swung shut. The engine turned over once, twice, and caught. Lights off. He pulled forward onto the Forest Service road by memory. He had driven it enough times that his hands knew the curves, without his eyes needing to. It was Willa who saw the figure first. "Left side," she said, very calm, at the road edge. Declan saw him, a man stepping out from the tree line onto the road ahead, one hand raised, the international gesture of stop, and in the other hand something that caught the ambient light from the snow. Not a weapon, a phone. He was trying to photograph the truck plates. Declan did not stop. He swung the truck hard left onto the untouched snow of the shoulder, cutting around the man at a distance that left no doubt about his intentions without making contact, and brought it back onto the road on the other side. In the rearview mirror, the figure stood very still in the disturbed snow for a moment, then reached for something at his hip. "Get down," Declan said. The rear window of the Silverado shattered. Willa was already below the dash. Declan kept the truck moving, accelerating now, lights still off, the snow-covered road reflecting just enough gray light from the sky to navigate by. Another shot, higher this time, catching the roof panel, and then the curve of the road took them out of line of sight, and the shooting stopped. 3 minutes later they hit gravel, then pavement. The secondary highway opened up ahead of them, empty and dark and going east toward the city. Declan drove for 5 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "Are you hurt?" "No." A pause. "You?" "No." Another pause. "Glass a little." "It's fine." She sat up from the floor of the truck slowly. Her face in the dashboard light was composed, which surprised him less than it might have an hour ago. "Where are we going?" Declan thought about this carefully. The RCMP was not an option, not until he knew how far Pemberton's reach extended, and Raymond Crane's documents told him how far that was. The city was watched. His cabin was now compromised. "I know a Crown prosecutor in Edmonton," he said. "She worked with your father 6 years ago, before Bridgewater. She's not connected to the Calgary operation." He glanced at Willa. "Your father never mentioned her?" Willa shook her head, then stopped. "He mentioned a woman named Aldous," she said slowly. "He said she was the most honest lawyer he'd ever met, and that was the most suspicious thing about her." Declan almost smiled. That sounded exactly like Raymond. They drove through the dark toward Edmonton, the stolen gold of a dead man's evidence riding in a harness against his daughter's ribs, the mountains falling away behind them into the black. In the seat beside him, Willa unzipped the parka the rest of the way and finally let it fall from her shoulders. She leaned her head back against the headrest and closed her eyes, not in defeat, but with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding themselves rigid against catastrophe for a long time, and has finally, for this moment, decided that the man next to her will hold it instead. Declan noticed this without commenting on it. He kept his eyes on the road and drove steadily north. Raymond Crane had spent 3 years building a case that no one was supposed to find. He had sent his daughter into the cold with his badge over her heart because he understood in the end that the most secure vault in the world isn't a building or a safe or a server. It is a person who refuses to break. Willa Crane had not broken. And Declan Ford, who had come to the wilderness to stop caring about the things that mattered, found that the wilderness had simply been storing that capacity for him, keeping it cold and preserved, waiting for the night a woman through the ice, and brought his old life back to the surface of the river with her. He would deliver the evidence. He would clear Raymond Crane's name. And when it was done, when the Bridgewater matter was finally open and bleeding in the light of a courtroom, and the men who had built their careers on Raymond's silence had been reduced to the size they deserved, he thought he might ask Willa Crane if she wanted to see the river in the spring. It was different in May, quieter. The current still moved fast, but the light on it was something worth watching. If you had the time to stand on the bank and look,